So hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be continuing on my series of reviews for the read-along I'm currently hosting of Anthony Powell's A Dance with the Music of Time, and today I'm going to be talking about the third book in the series, which is The Acceptance World. Quickly to run through what happens in this book. Like most of the series, it is fairly episodical, but we pick up with Nick when he's in his late 20s. In the first chapter, he meets with his Uncle Giles in the hotel where Uncle Giles lives, and he also meets a woman who is potentially Uncle Giles's kind of girlfriend called Myra, who claims to have kind of supernatural powers and reads tarot cards for Nick and Giles. Later, when due to meet Mark Members for dinner for a kind of professional occasion to discuss getting an introduction to one of the books at the company he works for, he runs into Peter Templar and then also Peter Templar's wife Mona and Peter Templar's sister Jean, who Nick was kind of in love with when he was a teenager. They then run into Quiggin, who Nick went to university with, and Nick ends up going home with the Templars to the house in which they live and beginning on this kind of love affair with Jean, which is the main focus of this book. The next day, Quiggin comes along and joins in the Templar party for the day, as does Jibby Stripling, Peter Templar's ex-brother-in-law, and bizarrely Myra, who Nick met about a year before in the scene we saw at the beginning of the book. The book kind of follows Nick's relationship with Jean in one very important scene in the second half of the book to a kind of old boys dinner from his old school where he meets Charles Stringham, somewhat the worse for wear for drink. He also meets Wimmerpool, and he also sees his old housemaster who has a stroke. And the book ends with Jean finding out that her husband, from whom she has been effectively separated, is coming back from abroad. So I want to talk quickly about the things that I love about this book. Like the rest of the series, I adore the writing and I find the book just absolutely hilarious. There are some wonderful kind of scenes of visual humour. Wimmerpool trying to get Stringham to stay in bed when Stringham is completely drunk, and him and Nick are trying to look after him. Such an absurdly powerful moment. The fact that Labar has a stroke because he is sort of so bored and appalled by the fact that Wimmerpool is making an uninvited speech at the old boys' dinner, especially because Labar is suggested to be okay. It is kind of grotesquely comic in a way. I also love the kind of coincidences and connections that run throughout the book, and the ways in which people that Nick has known from his previous life crop up again and again. You know, he meets Myra with Uncle Giles, and then suddenly Myra appears when he's having lunch with Peter Templar a year later. The fact that he ends up at one point in the book at Mrs. Adrianus' house, which we visited in the first book, and the fact that Mrs. Adrianus's then boyfriend ends up being the secretary to St. John Clark at the end. There are so many little coincidences running throughout the whole of this series, which is one of the things I love because I think it makes it so rewarding to read. One of the things I also really like about this book is the relationship between Nick and Jean and the way it is explored, especially as it is the first kind of proper relationship we see Nick have in the series. And I think the reflections on love in this book are really kind of beautifully and nicely done, and I find really interesting. I find the book quite interesting from like a gender perspective as well, because Nick does speak a lot about women as though they are kind of different and unknowable in so many ways, but then he also kind of treats everyone like that. And also for some reason it doesn't bother me, even though he says things which you wouldn't say today. I think because they feel like they are so much about the time the books were written in and the time the books are set in, and about Nick's kind of personal attitude more than anything else. And I think the way that Nick kind of views women as sort of unknowable is also kind of pushed because of his relationship with Jean and the fact that he doesn't really know what she's thinking, and the fact that their relationship is so complicated. She is married and has a child with another man, and although she is kind of half separated with her husband, she has this whole other life that Nick is not a part of. Nick doesn't know anything really about her daughter, and the daughter is mentioned very rarely, and Nick even says at one point that he finds it weird that he knows that so much of Jean's life is taken up with this daughter, and yet that's not a part of his life, that's not the part of the life they share. They lead this kind of secret, clandestine existence, which means that of course the way Nick is going to view love and going to view the person he is in love with is kind of unknowable, because they have to lead such separate lives because of their circumstances. He says at one point in a kind of sweeping statement that at any given point there are two people someone is in love with, the real person and their like invented version of the real person. And reflections like that I think are really interestingly done in this book, and something I really enjoy about it. Another thing I love about this book is the ending. I find it like really emotional, just the final ending, because it's so like subtle, I think, almost, the final conversation between Nick and Jean that we get in this book. Did Peter mention that Bob is back in England? Yes. And that his prospects are not too bad? Yes. That may make difficulties. I know. Don't let's talk of them. No. Darling Nick. It's so understated, and part of the kind of issue, I suppose, with a lot of Jean and Nick's relationship is that they can't ever really discuss their situation because it is so fragile, really, and because they are happy with each other, and so to discuss the fact that they don't necessarily have a future, or that the future is very complicated because of Jean's husband, is so kind of complicated that they just don't talk about it, they just don't discuss it, they know things are difficult and they just say, let's not talk about it. And it's really, like, I find that, like, almost more powerful and heartbreaking, but yeah. Okay, as I've done with the other two reviews for the first two books in the series, I want to talk a bit about some of the characters in particular, and then about a few of the particular themes in this one. I want to talk about Jean, who I spoke about a bit in the last video, but not that much, because I think especially in the first and second books, Jean doesn't really come into focus, and it's this book in which she does come into focus a bit more, but even then she does remain a little bit kind of unknowable to Nick. Or perhaps Nick kind of views her as unknowable, though we get quite a strong sense of her, almost like he knows her better than he almost thinks he does. I mentioned in my last video, the review of A Buyer's Market, that there were two moments in the book that stuck with me, like, long after I had read the series, and I first read the series must be, yeah, 7 years ago, and one of the moments was Barbara Goring pouring sugar all over Wimmerpool's head, and the other moment is the fact that Jean opens the door naked to Nick, and he's a bit like, oh, this is quite scandalous, just because I think it's so very, like, 1920s, 1930s, it just feels so very, like, interwar, because it's not something that could have been written, yeah, 40 years before. And it is a kind of almost shocking moment in a way, and it tells us something about Jean's character. They are incredibly careful about their relationship, and they are incredibly cautious, but at the same time, Jean has this slightly more kind of impulsive, risque nature to her as well, which is something I find really interesting. The relationship her and Nick have, how it is both secret and open, how they can go to certain clubs together and spend lots of time together, but they can't tell her brother, and she is still married, and he doesn't really know much about her life or her daughter and so on. And the fact that she is kind of willing to risk that, and the fact that she is content to kind of go along with that situation and not discuss it, is, I think, quite interesting. The fact that for her, as much as Nick, it is about kind of savouring the moment in a way and not really thinking about what the future holds. You see both the kind of cautious and the impulsive side of her nature, and we also see that there are things that Nick doesn't understand about her, especially in her relationships with men, why she married Bob DePort, why she had an affair with Jimmy Stripling. And we also get the sense that she is very intelligent, both in terms of being interested in art and books like Nick, but also in her kind of emotional intelligence, and the fact that she and Nick both kind of manage to puzzle out what's going on between Peter and Mona. I want to also talk a bit about Charles Stringham, because Charles is, as I've said before, one of my favourite characters in the series, and it's very interesting to compare him in the first book to how he appears in the third book. When we see him at this dinner, Nick hasn't seen him for a while, and he's recently been divorced, and he's just completely drunk and kind of makes a fool of himself in a way, but at the same time he is hilarious, and I love his dialogue. Like, Charles's dialogue, I think, makes him so lovable. "Look here," said Stringham, "I must be allowed to get in and out of my own bed. That is a fundamental human right. Other people's beds may be another matter. In them, another party is concerned, but ingress and egress of one's own bed is unassailable." So these are the famous Wimmerpool good manners, are they? This is a celebrated Wimmerpool courtesy of which I have always heard so much. Here is the man who posed as another Lord Chesterfield. Let me go, you whited sepulchre, you serpent, you small-time Judas, coming into another man's house in the guise of paying a social call and then holding him down in his bed. He is incredibly funny, and yet it's also utterly sad, as I think Nick finds too. He starts laughing at the grotesque scene, and yet it's also quite sad that Stringham has kind of come to this, that we know he drinks too much, his marriage has fallen apart very rapidly, we don't know what he does for a job now. At school he had these fits of depression, and now a lot of his life seems to be like that. Peter Templar is another figure I think interesting to look at. When at school Nick kind of looks up to Peter and Charles so much and views them as kind of people who have their lives much more together than him, and who have a lot of success with women in a way he doesn't, and yet we see in this book that Charles Stringham's marriage has fallen apart, and Peter's wife leaves him very unexpectedly, and much really to Peter's confusion and to Nick's. Obviously Nick's relationship isn't exactly really steady and free of complications, but he is the only one in a loving relationship of those three. That when he was at school he considered them sort of much more able to know what to do when it came to love. And Peter is quite interesting because we get a sense of his affection for his wife, but also his inability to really make it work with her. The fact that Mona leaves him for Quiggin is not just to do with leaving him for Quiggin, but also to do with the complications and the disagreements that constantly come up between Peter and Mona themselves. I also want to quickly talk about Mona, because she is quite an interesting character. She certainly seems to have an impulsive nature too when it comes to inviting Quiggin suddenly to lunch and then kind of forgetting about Quiggin in her interest in Myra, and then later leaving Peter for Quiggin, despite the fact that Peter's kind of financial situation is much better, that she is married to Peter, and that she doesn't really know Quiggin that well. But she seems to want to live a kind of life of excitement and politics and art. She says to Peter that they never see interesting or intelligent people, and she longs for kind of more from life than what she has got, and feels really quite bored. And I think that sense of Mona's boredom is partly to do with why she leaves Peter for Quiggin, because she feels that she's not really making the full of life or living life to its full extent. Talking of Quiggin, he too is an interesting character. I always think that him and Wimberpool are quite interesting to compare, as they're both presented as people that Nick kind of underestimates at times, but also people who have this kind of intellectual or business power, these kind of abilities that Nick doesn't quite realise. I'll talk a little bit later about the theme of kind of politics and social change, but Quiggin's interest in Marxism is certainly important in this book, and likewise his kind of obsession with the logical nature of Marxism, but also his sudden ability to believe in the supernatural when it actually comes down to it. He is kind of appalled when Myra suggests they play planchette, but actually he is the person who ends up believing in it in the end and rushing off to phone his employer when he's worried that his employer is in danger. He's also incredibly touchy about his Marxism and the fact that he believes that someone around the table is making fun of him by putting Marxist quotes in the planchette thing. Now, I want to talk a little bit about St. John Clarke before I move on to talking about the themes, because St. John Clarke is quite an interesting character. He's one that is never in focus, and we never actually see him, except once from a distance when he's being pushed in a chair by Mona when they're out on the protest. And yet he's a character that kind of runs throughout this book and that we hear about constantly. The fact that Nick is constantly trying to get St. John Clarke to write this introduction for this book for his company is a thread that runs throughout this book. The kind of competition for position of secretary between Quiggin and Mark members is a very important part of this book, so that St. John Clarke is kind of constantly in the background, but we never really see him. He also acts as a kind of interesting, not exactly figurehead, but as a symbol of old establishment changing its views, and someone who used to be part of one world slowly drifting into another one, often with quite a lot of pushing from the young people around him who are kind of influencing his social and political views. Which leads me on quite nicely, I think, to talking about some of the themes in this book. And one theme I want to talk about is that of kind of politics and social change. Because I think St. John Clarke does act as this kind of symbol for the ways in which kind of different viewpoints are influencing society at this time. We see a great kind of change in politics, this increased interest in Marxism, and even sort of members of a particular kind of old establishment becoming converted to Marxism, and also the divisions within that. This is the first book in which politics has really seemed to play a very kind of active role. And we get a clear sense too of how society has changed. When I reviewed The Buyer's Market, I spoke about Nick going to these two parties in one night, the first of which feels almost like a Victorian ball, and the second of which feels much more like what we think about when we think about the interwar period in Britain. And he talks in this book about going to Mrs. Adrianus's house and remembering that party which at the time felt really new and like a new way of life, and now like that's more what life is like, sort of talking about how things have changed over the interwar period. And we see those same kind of social changes with all the marriages that are breaking up, and the way in which there is a slightly more kind of relaxed attitude towards certain relationships and sort of relationships outside of marriage. For example, if we think about Barnaby and Lady Anne. At the same time, social conventions do still hold their sway on the way in which people act. Jean does not seem to be remotely in love with Bob, and she has been separated from him for quite a while, but him coming back to England still makes a massive difference to her life and still puts her relationship with Nick in danger. Her and Nick don't talk about the future, and she certainly never mentions getting divorced from Bob in order to marry Nick. Another theme, in fact, of this book is kind of the impermanence of love. I spoke already about how one of the things I really like about this book is the ways in which it talks about love, but it's also a book which, despite the fact it is the most like a love story almost of any book in this series, it is also a book in which people are constantly swapping partners, in which lots of people leave people for other people. Mona leaves Templar for Quiggin, Anne leaves Barnaby for Dickie Umfreville. We're told that Charles's wife has left him and married someone else. Myra starts off the book with Uncle Giles and is then with Jimmy Stripling, who we also know previously had an affair with Jean after his relationship with Babs broke up. This is a book in which love is very, very fleeting, and in which people seem to change partners all the time. And although Jean and Nick are together for the majority of this book, their relationship is still shown to be in danger, and there is always this kind of sense that their relationship is not something which has that much of a future. A book in which permanence seems very hard to find, and Nick and Jean's relationship is more about kind of capturing savouring the moment than building something for the future. Another thing I want to mention quickly before I finish this video is the theme of kind of misjudgment, because it's something that I think plays an important part throughout the series. Nick is intelligent and he is emotionally intelligent, and certainly from the way in which he analyses characters throughout the series, you kind of get a sense that as a narrator, as a character, he loves looking into people and trying to understand them. And yet he often gets it wrong, especially with people like Quiggin and Wibberpool, who he's known for a long time and views in one way, and keeps on realising that's not quite the way to view them. He can't believe that Mona would leave Templar for Quiggin, because for him Templar is what women would like and Quiggin is just not. And he's obviously wrong about that, and there obviously is something about Quiggin which he doesn't quite see. And similarly with Wibberpool, he constantly underestimates Wibberpool, or views Wibberpool as he did when he was a schoolboy, and then realises that other people now view Wibberpool with much more respect, that Wibberpool is now very important in kind of business and is getting on, and that he's no longer quite the ridiculous figure that he was when he is at school. Except that he also kind of is, and that's one of the things I find quite interesting about Wibberpool. On the one hand, Nick gets him completely wrong, and Nick doesn't understand the role that Wibberpool can play in society and the role that Wibberpool can play in business. But on the other hand, Wibberpool is still kind of a little bit ridiculous and still kind of not socially at ease. He makes a speech that he was not invited to make at the old boys' dinner and ends up effectively giving his old housemaster a stroke. Like, Wibberpool, on the one hand, knows what he's doing in certain circles, and Nick doesn't understand that and misjudges him. But on the other hand, maybe Nick sees Wibberpool a bit more clearly than everyone else as well. So I think that's all I wanted to say about the acceptance world. It's a really, really great book that I love a lot, like the whole of the series. In the month of June, we will be reading the fourth book in the series, which is At Lady Molly's, and I'm just really excited to carry on with the series. I feel like it's been a nice distance of time since I read it, because I read it 7 years ago, so I feel like nostalgic reading it, but I don't remember very much at all, which is quite satisfying reading it, because I remember bits and pieces here and there, and then there are several books where I have no idea what happens in them. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know how you enjoyed the third book in the Dance the Musical Time, and I'm back very soon with another bookish video.